my name is Jamie Larson. I teach English here. I'm also part of the Restorative Practices Network. So I have the honor of introducing Joel, who I consider, I think, a friend and a mentor. So I'm really glad that you can join. Joel Friesz has served as the Executive Director of the National Association of Community and Restorative Justice since January 2022. Prior to this, Joel oversaw a statewide restorative justice program for 13 years at a nonprofit agency called Lutheran Social Services of North Dakota. During those years, Joel and his team worked with communities across North Dakota and the region to implement restorative practices into K-12 schools, the juvenile justice system, adult corrections, higher ed, and other community entities. In addition to being an NDSU alum, Joel has had the opportunity to partner with NDSU on restorative practices and served as a facilitator of sexual assault prevention and advocacy for the Office of Student Life from 2015 to 2017. A native of Flasher, North Dakota, I'm not sure where that is, but Joel has resided in Fargo for over 25 years. So please help me welcome Joel Friesz.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you for having me. After I graduated from NDSU in 2001, I didn't go too far. I bought a house a few years after, so I'm only 6 blocks away from campus, so I didn't go too far. I'm going to just jump right into the presentation. Thank you for being here. I know there's a lot of things that call our attention and a lot of places for us to be, so I appreciate you being here and hearing about restorative justice. So I thought I would start by showing this picture. I stumbled across this a few years ago when I was working with K-12 schools. And this is a picture of my elementary school. So I know this makes it look like I grew up in like the 1800s. And I'm not that old, but I grew up in Western North Dakota by Bismarck area. I went to a one-room country school for my first 7 years of school. And this was a few years after it closed. It eventually closed. And someone purchased it. They moved it onto a stack mover type thing, and they moved it to another place and they turned it into a home for someone. I show this picture, or it comes to mind when I think about restorative practices in education, because I think back to this. We had one teacher and we had 9 students, 3 of which were my siblings. So when I think about implementing like a new process or a new philosophy into a school, like how easy it would have been in this kind of school. You would only have to train one teacher on it. Schools today, of course, are much more complex, involving thousands of people within their communities like NDSU. But that's where I thought I would start. I decided to show this graph at the beginning so that all of you are involved with the NDSU community in some way, either as a staff member, faculty, student. And I want, if you're new to restorative justice or restorative practices, I kind of wanted you to start thinking about where would this fit within a college or university. So I decided to put this graph up front. I labeled this kind of the main pathways that restorative justice can take shape in a university. It can be in places like the mission of the whole university, in the strategic planning or the way senior leadership operates. It can be in places like academic affairs and coursework. There's many colleges and universities today that have degrees in restorative justice or restorative practices, or coursework at least. It can be about the way we teach our courses, the way we operate our courses. And it can also be in departmental conflict and academic dishonesty, how to respond to those kind of things. It can also be in student affairs, student misconduct, residential life is a great place for restorative practices to take shape, in orientation, prevention, education, and athletics. And it can also be in human resources, in the hiring of staff in situations where there's staff conflict and in professional development. So I'm going to pause just a moment for you to hopefully the area of NDSU that you are part of shows up someplace there, but even if it doesn't, these are just some of the pathways in a college or universities. It can show up in so many different other places. Whenever I speak about restorative justice, I've been involved in the field for almost 20 years. It'll be January of 2005 is when I got hired as a facilitator, a restorative justice facilitator for juvenile court cases. So it'll be 20 years coming up this January. My thinking has evolved. I speak about restorative justice much differently today than I did 10 years ago and for sure 20 years ago. But whenever I speak about it, there's a few important overarching things that I'd like to say about it. So these are just a few things before I kind of dive into the way restorative justice looks in a university. One is the why. I feel when I speak about restorative justice, in addition to defining it and saying like, this is what it is, it's equally important for me to explain the why. Why do we do this? Why did restorative justice become a thing that systems look at? For me, it's very grounded in the values of safety and belonging. And all of the work that I've done in working with victims of crime, working with people that commit crimes, or just anybody else that I've come across, I've never met anybody that does not want there to be safe communities. But yet our communities are not safe in so many different ways. And to me, restorative justice is kind of asking, what can we do differently in our system so that hopefully we can continue to strive for community safety? And it's also grounded in the value of belonging. So in this way, you can think about the college campus of NDSU or any other community, but that it's built upon the premise that all people want to feel a sense of belonging in their community. And that the more that we can help people feel belonging, the less likely they will be to harm their community. So to me, those are some of the grounding principles of restorative justice. And I didn't say this yet in the beginning, but I'll say it now. Over on the side here, I intentionally wrote the words restorative justice and restorative practices because those words get used interchangeably. Sometimes it's referred to it as restorative justice in education, sometimes it's restorative practices in education. The way that my acknowledgement is it gets used interchangeably. They do have separate definitions and can mean different things, but largely I think when people speak about them, they're meaning the same thing. For me, when I say restorative justice, I am thinking more about the justice system, the intervention side of things. Restorative practices, it's used more in educational settings because it's not just about justice. It's about the set of practices that we have in both community building ways and in intervention ways. Okay, so restorative justice, one of the ways that it became a thing was in the 1970s. People started to relook at the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system wasn't delivering all of the things that maybe it was intended to. People were feeling that victims were largely left out of the criminal justice system. So restorative justice, I remember when I first got trained in restorative justice in 2005, it was kind of this eye-opener that it's not just focused on punishing the offending party, but it's built on accountability of the offending person, the person who commits the offense. And it's also thinking about what are the needs of the victim, which are very different than what the criminal justice system asks of us. It seeks to address things like mass incarceration and disparities. That restorative justice became a thing to rethink mass incarceration. The United States incarcerates more people than any other country in the world. So on one hand, you would if the measurement was that the more people we incarcerate, the safer our communities are. The United States would be like extremely safe in all ways, and we're not in all ways. So it's became a thing because of that and disparities. Our current criminal justice system incarcerates Black and brown people, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, more than other populations at really disparate rates. And restorative justice also became a thing to try to look at that and think, why is that happening and what can we do to change that? And it's not necessarily an either or, like it's restorative justice or it's criminal justice, or in education, either you utilize restorative practices or you don't. They're very combined with one another. I remember when I was a student at NDSU in one of my criminal justice classes, this was 20 plus years ago. I remember there being one section of one chapter in my criminal justice class about restorative justice. And I remember it and thinking like, either you work in the criminal justice system or you work in this other very different thing called restorative justice. Once I came into my work life and I was working with the court systems, I saw that it's blending. It's even how to make the criminal justice system more restorative. So it's not necessarily an either or. It's both an overarching strategy and a specific set of techniques. So sometimes when people talk about revamping the criminal justice system, they're using the word restorative justice. But it's also very specific processes, like something called restorative conferencing, where you're bringing harmed parties together to come together for a dialogue. So when I got trained initially, I was a restorative justice facilitator. So it's a very specific process to bring parties together. And it's intervention as well as prevention. Most people think about restorative justice as being, again, on the justice side of things, that it's only an intervention. And that's what I thought too, because my entry point to restorative justice was through the criminal justice system. And then when I started working in school systems, it opened this whole other side of things that I saw, the community building side of things. It can be utilized in any system, justice, education. One of the ones that I see more and more in the role that I have currently working with nationally with restorative justice is implementing restorative practices into healthcare systems is one of the ones that I see the growth area. Workplaces and families. I think about the family element very much. I think about my own family. For many years, about 10 years, I was working in school systems multiple times a week, working with educators. And so often in those times after a training on restorative justice, someone would come up to me afterwards and say, how can I do this within my family? Not just thinking about the systems that we work, but with our own families. I speak to you both as a professional, on a professional level and a personal level. I am very proud that in the state of North Dakota, if a victim of a crime wants to meet with the person who committed that crime against them, they have the right to do so. That was not always the case. So if you, are a victim of a crime and the other party is incarcerated at the state pen in Bismarck, you have the right to get to meet with that person through a restorative process. I mentioned also because in a lot of school systems, so you might have children, grandchildren, nieces and nephews. In a lot of school systems that utilize restorative practices, they use a model of restorative practices to bring parties together too. So I mention it because it's something that you might seek out in your professional life, but it might be something for your personal life at some point too. And I always acknowledge that the restorative justice is rooted in Indigenous wisdom, both in Indigenous and Native tribes of North America, but in other Indigenous communities of other countries as well. I feel very lucky to live in North Dakota, where we have 5+ tribal nations, where I've got to work with many of them over the past 15 years. And I encourage you, as you learn about restorative justice, it's good to come to workshops like this. I've learned a lot about restorative justice in workshops and trainings, but I've learned equally as much from spending time at Standing Rock or Fort Berthold or Spirit Lake and listening to Indigenous elders speak about some of these concepts. So I encourage you to seek out information on it in different ways. Okay. Although I've worked in restorative practices for a while, I still sometimes have a hard time describing what it is. It's sometimes, you know, if someone works in social work and they ask, hey, what do you do? And it's like, I'm a social worker. People kind of get a gist of like what that is, or I'm a professor. Sometimes when I say I work in restorative justice, it's not as easily to like, someone just knows exactly what that is. So I think about my elevator speech, you know, like this 2 to 3 minute thing, if we ever have to introduce ourselves, and I think about this slide. Because if I had to strip down what restorative practices means in an education system as bare bones as possible, it is building relationships and it is repairing relationships. And it's always going to be thinking about everything in those terms. How do we build relationships with our students and with everybody in the community, in the school community? And it acknowledges that we know that relationships are going to get broken. We know that anytime we put hundreds of people together, dozens of people together, thousands of people together, we're going to have conflict. And restorative practices kind of like proactively thinks about that. What can we do when we know conflict's going to come up? So this is my starting point. This is my starting point with talking about restorative practices in education. This was a graph, a little chart that I made a few years ago. And I, you know, even though we're here at NDSU today at a college, university, most of my experience with restorative practices is in the juvenile justice system and K-12 education. So some of this information, this was a graph I developed a few years ago when I was working with K-12 educators, and I think it fits for here too. But so building upon that last one where it's about building relationships and repairing relationships, I'm adding in the academics piece here. That it's about academics, it's about community building, it's honoring the diversity of the students who come into our classrooms and our buildings and our campuses every day. And it's trying to create a sense of belonging for all people, you know, through very specific strategies. It's also about repairing relationships. These are a few things that I get pushback, or I think the field of restorative practices could get pushback on sometimes, but it's saying that discipline can be done in a way that heals and connects relationships. And that discipline ideally should be done in a way that is viewed as fair to the student. And discipline can potentially be done in a way that does not create anger or resentment towards people in authority. I have had people tell me that they don't care if discipline is viewed as fair to the student or, you know, given a consequence. It's like, this is the rule, you broke it, too bad, too sad, this is the consequence, you have to pay. I do not view that as the wisest way to go about school discipline today. Students today have a lot more options maybe available to them that come into their mind about how they can retaliate against a school system more than I did 25 years ago when I was in school. Some of the things that happen today hadn't happened at that time with school violence and some of those things. So I do think it challenges us to think about how can we do discipline in a way that is healing. It maintains the connection with the student and it does not create anger. It doesn't mean that we can't hold students accountable. We can hold students accountable and we should, but just it's rethinking the way we do it. The other thing I want to say is about the community building aspect. I've also had people say to me that school is about learning academics and we're not here to like necessarily build relationships with everyone or help students build relationships with themselves. You know, that it's like school is to come to learn science, math, you know, the academics and everything else in, you know, secondary. A restorative mindset is going to really bring in the relationship piece and views it that the relationship is the most important thing. The way that the students' relationships are with the school and with their peers will maybe make or break the academics piece, you know? So depending on how you fall in that way of thinking, to maybe just think about the importance of the relationship for students in a school system. By definition, this is what we've used as a definition for restorative practices. It's a continuum of practices from informal to formal that includes proactive pieces like building relationships in community and responsive processes to repair harm. Some of the examples I've given there: community building circles, restorative questions, responsive circles, and restorative conferencing. We're not going to be able to get through all of these today, and maybe just like a fraction of them. Maybe about 10 years or so ago, there was a school system in Western North Dakota that asked us to come out and kind of give them the full gamut of restorative practices. They kind of wanted to implement it and they wanted to hear the whole thing. So we went out there and it took us 4 days to get through all of these pieces, you know, because that's how much time it kind of takes to sort through. So even in this, you know, session today, some of you who are in this room and maybe some online are familiar with restorative practices already. You know, if you're just hearing about it for the first time, it's like we're kind of just hitting the tip of that iceberg with it as kind of like an introduction to it. Okay. Maybe I'll ask this question since we have a few people in the room. Does a college setting use a triangle like this when talking about like a multi-tiered system support? No. Yeah. I used to speak about restorative practices on a left to right continuum. That like you start over here with informal practices and community building and it moves over this way. Maybe about 10 years ago or so, maybe not quite that long ago, North Dakota school systems, the Department of Public Instruction in North Dakota, started using this triangle called a multi-tiered system of support to talk about the way prevention and intervention efforts can be put into a school system. At that time, it made sense for me and us to put restorative practices into this triangle to help educators make sense of this. One of the things when we used to, in working with K-12 schools, and an educator would find out like, oh, we're implementing restorative practices. Some of the feedback would be like, I don't have time for that. You know, it's like my plate is already so full. So how am I now going to do this thing, like whatever it is, called restorative practices? So I felt that part of my responsibility was to help educators see that restorative practices is not necessarily like just doing another thing, but it's falling into this continuum of different supports. So on the base level, it's tier 1 things. Just what is something that every student who comes into our school or onto our campus should experience? It's just universal precaution for everybody. The next tier is talking about what are some targeted interventions, kind of responsive strategies that we can do for students who need those kind of supports. And then at the top tier, tier 3, is really reserved for a small group of students and people who need that kind of intensive support, you know, on their school journey. When the very first school district I started working with was Bismarck Public Schools. And it was about 2009. I think we started about 2008, got things rolling in 2009. At least from what I know, it's the very first school district in North Dakota who started using restorative practices. It had, you know, other parts of the country had been using it. That was our entry point. In the very beginning, what we did for the school district was we provided this tier 3 intervention called restorative conferencing. When students acted out, committed, you know, some kind of a rule violation, we would have someone from outside the school come in from the organization I was working with, and we came in and did this intervention where we worked with the students. I believe in that process very, very much, and I'm an advocate for it. But we knew that if we really wanted systems change and community change and culture change, that was not going to get us very far. So we eventually started thinking about how can we bring this down into other parts of the school so that you're focused on the community building aspect in the hopes that conflict and harm won't arise as much down the road. So as we did that, we went way to the base of things. And this again, I mean, I started this presentation kind of talking about the why. You know, why is this important? Why is this a thing? And I start here when I talk about this triangle too. My point with this is I don't just look at restorative practices in school because there's nothing better to do when we have extra time on our hands to do different things. It's in response to many, many things going on in our world today. So at the base, my why for restorative practices is thinking about all of the things that impact a school community. Things like mental health, things like adverse childhood experiences, the adversities that we all go through. The adults, the staff and faculty of the school, and of course the students who come into our classrooms. Trauma, individual trauma, family trauma, generational trauma. Some students have a negative viewpoint of an education system before they ever come into our schools. So it's not even starting off on equal footing. Housing, food insecurities, oppression, racism, poverty, current events that are happening, all of these things. A school system cannot take these things away necessarily. If you're familiar with the adverse childhood experiences study, and if someone's not, I encourage you to look into it, but I'm thinking that most of you, many of you are. But it looks at 10 ACEs that a young person can go through in the first 18 years of life and how that impacts someone. I consider myself to have grown up in the most common, I don't want to use the word normal necessarily, because I don't know what normal means, of households. But even when I came to NDSU, I would have had 2 ACEs in my life from my early life experiences, And it's not that a college campus or a school system can take them away, but they can do things on that tier 1 level that are trauma informed and trauma responsive. So we're being responsive in those ways to the students who are experiencing those things. Maybe I'll ask, with this being in person and virtual, I'm trying to think about how to even take questions or ask for feedback, but I'm going to ask for feedback. And if we were all together in the same space, I would have had to sit in a circle. I am more of a circle dialogue person than I am in this way, but being in 2 different avenues with this presentation, I'm not able to do some of those things. But regarding factors that impact a college campus, are there any things that you notice that are missing? That things that you see pop up within your sphere that impact the college campus?
I think first generation students, I know you talked about trauma, but I think first gen students are a little bit different.
First generation students is something that someone mentioned.
Just all the students being in transition in general, like moving and the healthy students that's considered like a confidence stressor. So all the students are coming in just elevated.
Yeah, so students in transition. I don't know if the online folks can hear this, but I'm repeating some of the message, but maybe they can hear it out there, so maybe. Finances. Current politics. Definitely. Things that are being debated on statewide levels, national levels, legislation, things that are going on impact people for sure. So this first tier, and I'm gonna touch on a few things in each one of these tiers. Again, so that when you leave here today, you had never heard about restorative justice, even though you aren't gonna remember all of these things, I hope some of your takeaways will be just that it encompasses a lot of different things, both about community building and interventions. So on this first tier, it's about relationship building, community building, and creating an environment where all people feel a sense of belonging. I'm gonna give us to really simplify this tier, I'm gonna invite us to think about something. So I'm gonna invite you to think about when you were a child, a teenager, or even younger. And when you think about the values that were instilled in you by the adults in your life. So it might be your parents, it might be your grandparent, it might be a coach, an aunt or uncle, a friend, a foster parent, a guardian. But start thinking about what values were instilled in you when you were a child. And it could be things like work ethic, or to work hard, or be calm, whatever things come into mind for you. Another way to think about it is, now that you are an adult and you have students, or you have your own children, or your grandchildren, or nieces and nephews, what is a value that you would like to instill in the next generation? So I'm gonna have us pause and just think about that for a second. And if a few different ones float into your mind, and just try to land on one. Take a sharing. Just by shout out, and if anybody followed along who's online, if you want to type it into the chat box, if that's an option. But what is the value that came to mind for you when you thought about that?
Continuous education.
Continuous education.
I wasn't empathy.
Empathy. Authenticity. Humility is one that comes to mind for me. It's one that I should say. Any other ones come to mind for people? I would say that one of the foundational components of restorative practices is helping people identify their values and helping people connect on those shared values. In some ways, it's such a simple concept, but it's something that is not the way most things are looked upon. It's not telling people what their values are, but it's helping them identify them. And when I think about some of the processes that we use in tier 1 called circle process, which is a communication process, a dialogue process that's inspired and built upon many indigenous practices. In that process, we often talk about things like values. And in all of my years of doing restorative practices, I cannot think of a single time where I have gotten a group of students or adults or whoever together and we talk about values where people do not find commonality in their values. So it's trying to create a space where we're coming about how do we have, looking at how much we have in common with each other, opposed to how much we have not kind with each other. Thinking about politics. And I say this in a neutral way, depending what political party you affiliate with. But as I watch, this year and in past years, the presidential debates, and I look at the way that the presidential debate is set up, I often think about, I wonder how differently this would look if it was based on a restorative conversation. If we would look at things like grounding ourselves in values and guidelines, which we haven't talked about too much, opposed to just identifying what we have different with each other. I think it would be profoundly different. And when I think about, different ways of communication that I hope that our generation and the next generation have, it's about how to talk with each other and inviting a lot of different voices and hear a lot of different perspectives. And that's what happens in this tier of things. Just make sure. So community building circles, these processes, identifying agreements and guidelines. Residential life is one place that I know universities implement some of these processes. It's like either we know we're going to bring all these students into our spaces, and either we can plan for conflict and harm to happen, or we don't have to. But it's like we know conflict and harm can happen. So what can we do at these stages to mitigate it as much as possible? In tier 2, where I'm not going to dive into this one too much, but I just want you to know it's there. And this is the responsive processes now for addressing harm, conflict, repairing relationships. We have things called responsive circle, restorative dialogue. Whenever, in all of my years of being involved with restorative justice, when it comes to circle process to me is one of the most beautiful and meaningful processes out there. It is not something I ever give a PowerPoint presentation on, because I cannot convey to you the way a circle operates and the energy in a circle by standing up here and saying what it is. So I want to put it here so you know it's a thing. But if you've never experienced circle, I invite you to seek it out someplace where there is a circle being hosted, by someone, because it's a really powerful process. In tier 3, this is those intensive individualized processes, things like restorative conferencing, restorative boards, just like you have administrative hearings and boards, those can be done in a restorative model as well. The one that I'm going to talk through for the rest of our time together, we have about 15 minutes left or so, and I'll try to end a little early just in case anybody has any questions. But the one I'm going to talk through a little bit about is the restorative conferencing. Even though I have taken different roles with restorative justice over the years, at my heart and at my core, I still consider myself a restorative facilitator in this tier 3 process. That is what I spent so many years doing, working with our justice systems, our Department of Corrections, and I've seen really transformational things come out of that process. So that's the piece that I'm going to spend time on. Before I dive into that, I remember this PowerPoint slide or something very similar to it the first time I went to a restorative justice session 20 years ago. And I continuously dig out these 3 questions if I ever get confused about the way to proceed with a situation that I'm working with in restorative justice. The criminal justice system, I would say you could say criminal justice or traditional discipline practices within the school system. Okay, same thing. It often asks what laws have been broken, who did it, and what punishment do they deserve. Those are the 3 primary questions of the criminal justice system. A restorative justice framework asks who has been hurt, what are their needs, and whose obligations are those. And if we would have more time, I could give us scenarios to walk through these things to kind of demonstrate it, but I think you can see how different it is. In the beginning, I talked about restorative justice becoming a thing because victims were largely left out of the criminal justice system, and many victims feel that way still today about the criminal justice system. This, I mean, you can see where there is not much space for victim involvement in this set of questions. It's not asking anything about the victim necessarily. This one opens the door to think about both parties, the party who caused the harm in the situation and the person who was directly harmed in the situation. Something just popped in my head that I wanted to say as I was thinking about coming here today. Back in 2016 or so, I think it was, for 3 years, I served as it was just a part-time thing that I did for NDSU, but it was through, I'm gonna forget some of the details now, but it was on sexual assault awareness and bystander training. And I don't know if they still have that same, sounds like they still have that same division. But for 3 years, I served as a facilitator, and this was one of the rooms we used to teach that course into all incoming students. And it was a 90-minute session that students had to go through, maybe still go through today, good. Which I am so proud of NDSU offering that. But that, as I was thinking about this framework, to me, that prevention class that is being offered to students is a tier 1 thing. It's saying that every student on this campus should be aware of this and should be informed of what they can do as a bystander. It was really framed in the lens of a bystander, at least when I was a part of it. Because up in tier 3, we know that sexual assaults happen on college campuses, you know? So why would we just wait for those things to happen at that level? Why would we not do something down here? So even though that course isn't necessarily restorative practice, you know, it falls in the same continuum. You know, I mean, it is part of this whole type of model, but that's one example. And I know that if we would get NDSU folks together from different departments, you would be able to plug in dozens and dozens of things that fall into all of these categories. Some of what you're all doing falls in here, some falls in tier 2, and some falls in tier 3. So it's not, this model is not just about restorative justice practices. It's about all prevention and intervention efforts. Okay. So restorative conferencing. I decided to give a slide on this instead of some of the other restorative practices that we've talked about, because it is a signature process of restorative justice. A few things that I want to say about this. Restorative conferencing, back in the day, and probably some areas still refer to it as this, but back in the day, it used to be called victim offender dialogue, VODs, victim offender dialogue. And I think some places still call it that. We have been, or I try to be very intentionally about the words that I use. I try not to use the word offender in anything that I'm doing. And I'm careful also how I use the word victim or survivor in things. So years ago, when I was at Lutheran Social Services, instead of calling it victim offender dialogue, we started calling it restorative conferencing to take out some of the labeling pieces out there. But the process involves situations where there's people impacted by a situation. There's a pre-meeting stage. It might be one pre-meeting or it might be a dozen pre-meetings. There's a face-to-face meeting between the parties if they choose to come together. And there's follow-up. It's a very thorough process. This process, when I used to be with K-12 schools, I would say this is not an educator pulling two students aside and saying, hey, you two shake hands with each other and say you're sorry and go on with your way. This would be the opposite of that kind of process. There's certain factors to have in place, but there's preparation, Any participant may stop. It's voluntary. The victim, the harmed party has to want the process, be involved in the process. The person who commits the act has to be willing to be involved in it. Parties can bring support people, there's follow-up, and there's whoever is doing it, hopefully is a trained facilitator. But I mentioned this process, and going back to my piece about, speaking to you both on a professional and personal level, but I've known many people in my personal life who have gone through a process like this. Many people have been victims of crime. And I said this earlier, but I am really proud that in North Dakota, that this is open to people. And one of my points on this topic is, I don't believe restorative justice advocates for a victim to come together with the person who harmed them. I don't advocate for that. I advocate that the victim has a choice to come together with that person if they want to. And that's a big difference to me. I would never push a victim to do this kind of process, but I'm glad it's there if someone needs it. I wanted to share a few examples of situations I've been a part of. I was trying to think of college ones. I was trying to think of NDSU ones that I've been a part of that came to me through the juvenile court system is usually where I receive referrals from. But I can think of situations of car break-ins. I can think of a few cases I worked on 10, 15 plus years ago. The people responsible were not necessarily students here. They were maybe youth in the community, but they happened to be on NDSU campus and broke into vehicles. And in that situation, a referral came, when it came to restorative justice, I was working under Lutheran Social Services at that time, and that's where we reach out to the victim who were college students in some of those situations, and we reach out to the youth who did it, and you go through that whole process. But I distinctly remember bringing some NDSU students together with the youth in that process. Thefts, things like stealing. I can think of some specific situations where just a theft happened, on a campus or in a K-12 school. Fights, assaults. Sometimes in restorative conferencing, you have the direct parties involved. So it's like, say, two girls or two boys or whoever got in a fight at school. They're both charged as the offending party. They can go through a restorative process. They might have other consequences too, but mutual fights. And what I wanted to say with this one, I have also worked with school systems who have provided this process for like paras who are not necessarily involved in the fight, but witnessed the fight. And maybe we're not happy with the way the school handled the fight. So this process is not always about just the direct parties involved. It's about some of the other stakeholders in the community who maybe witnessed it or were involved in an indirect way. Racist videos. I can think of a situation, and these examples I'm giving are not NDSU specific. I'm just thinking of situations I've worked on. But I can think of one from many years ago in a different part of the state at a school where a really racist home video went viral within this community. And this the school did many different things. Considered expelling the student, but instead decided to take a different route to hold that person accountable. And one of the processes that student went through was a restorative conferencing process to meet with over a dozen people who were impacted by that video getting sent out. School threats I've worked on, students who have brought knives to campus, students who have threatened to harm a school. Some of those situations are very intensive and take a lot of time. And again, it's not an either or, so I wouldn't want you to think, well, I can't believe that student did have other consequences. They maybe did have other consequences, but this was one part of it. I worked on several homicide cases, mostly negligent homicide, where it's been a case of drunk driving, distracted driving, but where there wasn't death in a situation and the surviving family members wanted to meet with that other party. Most of the time, those situations take 9+ months, you know, before they go to that face-to-face interaction. But I share some of those to just kind of open our minds to the different kind of processes that are out there. In other systems, like criminal justice and some other systems, it usually is about keeping the parties separated. You know, we keep these people as far away from each other as possible. And being someone, again, who I feel I'm a victim advocate, we always want to ensure the safety of the victim. But if the victim is wanting to do this process for whatever reason it might be, you know, why wouldn't we do that for them if we can do a safe process? I grew up in small town North Dakota, and I've worked on a lot of small town cases in North Dakota. One thing that I have heard from so many families over the years, when we do this process, say a vandalism happened in the community, we go do the pre-meeting with the youth who was responsible, and the family says, we wanted to go apologize to that other family, but our attorneys or law enforcement told us not to. You know, they're like, don't go apologize. Then I go to the other family and talk with them, and that family says, so not just to say the victim's family, they say, I can't believe that other family would not have come and apologized to us. If my kid had did this, we would have apologized. And there are some of those things that cause so much rift and division that if these parties can just come together and ask questions and talk with one another, it can provide a lot of healing for them. Not everything can be healed, but some things can be healed. I want to show one more slide, and I know we're almost out of time. I want to give an example of a situation that I got to be a part of. It's scary to think that 2016 was not almost 10 years ago, but 8 years ago or so. But about 2016, there was 2 cohorts from North Dakota. One was from Cass County here in Fargo, and one was from Fargo County. And it was made up of different people: juvenile court representative, school representative, law enforcement, and service providers. And I fell under the category of service providers. We went through a program at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. through their juvenile justice reform. The project stemmed out of a need to address racial disparities in the North Dakota juvenile justice system. Numerous studies have been done over the past 10 years or more that show, just like in so many other ways across the country, that we have racial disparities in our juvenile justice system. So we did all of this to come up with a new juvenile diversion process. So what we did was we identified, there was 5 eligible offenses. These maybe won't mean that much to you, but it's disorderly conduct, sexual assault, theft, criminal mischief, disturbance of public school. We created other criteria. We had to rewrite policy. I mean, there was state statute that guided some of these things. It took years to recreate this, but it eventually created an avenue that instead of referring someone to juvenile court for maybe a low-level infraction, that there were other pathways to get this youth services. And I give some of these examples because when, you know, say you're in student misconduct or student conduct, how would you start chipping away to decide what situations to go to a restorative process and which ones do we not want to go to the restorative process? These are the 5 that we came up with that I think everyone trusted. Everyone wasn't ready to say, okay, we're gonna let everything get referred, you know, away from juvenile court, but these were the ones that people trusted. And that was our starting point. And I'm not with that organization anymore. And I know this has evolved in a lot of great ways, but this was our starting point. To pick some offenses that we can look at and start from there. So there's different ways to start. I'm going to pause. This is my last slide. And I know we're at the top of the hour and a minute past. I'm going to pause for just a moment to ask, are there any questions And even if I can't answer it right now, that I'm happy to follow up with you. But are there any questions that anybody has? A few books that I recommend if you're into reading, Until We Reckon is a book by, the author is Danielle Sered. Relooking at mass incarceration. This one focuses on that. It's one of my favorite books of the past few years that talks about our need to look at mass incarceration in our country. There's what's called the Little Book Series. They're very inexpensive. They're like $6 or $7, but this one is the Little Book of Restorative Justice. There's one called the Little Book of Restorative Justice for colleges and universities. There's one called the Little Book of Circle Processes. There's one called the Little Book of Restorative Justice in Education, but there's a whole series. They're on places like Amazon and other booksellers, but they're just quick reads if you're interested in exploring this topic anymore. So yes, thank you for having me. My contact information should be out there if you ever have any questions for me, and I'm gonna pass it over to Jessica.
Thank you so much for being here and for everything that you shared. I just wanted to share that we're going to continue to build on our conversation. Next week at the same day, on Tuesday at the same time, we have a book study where we're actually diving into that little book of Restorative Practices on college and universities. And then in 2 weeks, over Zoom, we're having a panel discussion with members of our community and here on NDSU campus to discuss about how restorative practices can be implemented across the university and in the classroom. So we hope everyone can join us for those two events as well.